the morning I learned my boy Samuel had taken a wife without a word to me. I sat at the old wooden table in my adobe kitchen, reckoning the coins I'd poured into keeping him and that woman fed. $3,000, near all I had managed to save in near on a decade, when Rebecca fixed me with a stare sharp as a knife and said, "We wed yesterday out at the ranch. Only those with true meaning were called." I knew then. In Colorado Territory. 1885, a half-Ute widow like me would never count for much, no matter how many of my late husband's hard-earned dollars I had laid down for them. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and the true meaning of belonging on the frontier. If you've ever felt like your love wasn't valued, or wondered how far family loyalty should go, this story will show you that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up for yourself, even when it means standing alone. The Colorado sun was just cresting the eastern peaks when I stepped onto my front porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air that carried the scent of pine and winter close behind. At 65, I still rose before dawn, a habit learned from both my Anglo father and my Ute mother, though she would have called it greeting the spirits of the new day. The High Meadow Ranch stretched before me, 1,500 acres of good grazing land, bordered by aspen groves that blazed gold in the morning light. My boots echoed against the wooden planks as I made my way to the barn, where I could already hear the low murmur of voices. Miguel and his son Carlos were preparing for the morning ride, checking the cattle in the far pastures. They'd worked for me for 8 years now, ever since my husband Thomas passed, and they treated this land with the same respect I'd learned from my mother's people. "Mornin', Miguel," I called, nodding to his worn hat. His weathered face creased into a smile that spoke true. Not like the stiff nods I sometimes got in town when people remembered my mixed heritage. "Buenos dias, Señora Eleanor. Cattle make it through the night?" he asked, checking the cinch on his saddle. "We'll see soon enough," I replied, running my hand along the neck of Thunder, my gray gelding who'd been my constant companion for 12 years. Carlos nodded from the next stall, his young face serious with the work ahead. At 19, he reminded me of Samuel at that age, eager, hardworking, respectful of the land and the animals that fed us all. I walked through the barn, checking each stall with a practiced eye of someone who'd spent 4 decades on this frontier. The horses nickered softly as I passed, their breath creating small clouds in the cool air. This routine grounded me, connected me to the earth in the way my mother had taught me, even as I managed the ranch work that kept food on our table. Back in the house, I settled at the kitchen table with my ledger and the small wooden box where I kept the ranch's earnings. I scratched the sums in my book: cattle sales, horse breeding, the small garden that supplied vegetables to the general store in town. Thomas had been wise with money, and I'd learned to be equally careful. The ranch provided well for one woman, with enough left over to help family when needed, and help I had, over the past 2 years. Since Samuel had taken up with that Eastern girl Rebecca, I'd sent them money regular, some here when their crop failed, some there when Rebecca claimed she needed medicine from Denver. All told, near $3,000, enough to buy cattle or mend the barn roof that leaked something fierce during heavy rains. I justified every payment as a mother's duty. Samuel was my only child, the product of my marriage to Thomas McKinnon, a good Irish-Scottish man who'd seen past the whispers about my Ute blood to the woman beneath. When Samuel was small, he'd loved hearing stories about his grandmother's people, about the seasons and the spirits, about living in harmony with the land. But as he grew older, especially after we moved closer to town for his schooling, those stories seemed to embarrass him. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted my counting. Through the window, I saw a rider approaching at a leisurely pace, Martha Schneider from the neighboring homestead. Her husband had died the same winter as Thomas, and we'd found comfort in our shared widowhood. She dismounted with the easy grace of a woman who'd spent her life on the frontier, though at 58, she was 7 years younger than me. "Eleanor," she called, her German accent still thick after 20 years in Colorado. "Got news from town you'll want to hear. Efim." I poured us coffee, sweetened with traded honey. Martha settled into the chair across from me, her blue eyes bright with the kind of excitement that usually meant gossip. "Young Samuel was in Brennan's store yesterday," she began, warming her hands around the cup. "Asking about ordering supplies for some kind of celebration. Said he had important news." My heart lifted despite my concerns about the money I'd been sending. Perhaps Samuel was finally ready to settle down proper, to bring Rebecca to meet me formal instead of the brief, awkward encounters we'd had in town. Marriage might mature him, help him understand the value of family bonds that went deeper than convenience. "What kind of celebration?" I asked, trying to keep the hope from my voice. Martha's expression grew more serious. "That's the curious part. Eleanor, when Mrs. Brennan asked if he wanted to order anything special for his mother. He got a strange look, said something about how some celebrations were meant for family only. A chill ran through me, though I couldn't have said why. Samuel had always been my pride, even when his choices puzzled me. Surely whatever news he had would include me. After all, I was his mother, the woman who'd raised him alone after Thomas's death, who'd taught him to ride and rope and respect the land that would one day be his inheritance. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. In a few hours, I would saddle Thunder and ride to town, perhaps stopping by Samuel's small farm to see what this mysterious news might be. My ledger lay open before me, its scratched numbers telling the story of my generosity, my hope that supporting my son's new life would strengthen the bonds between us. I had no way of knowing that by evening, those same numbers would show me just how wrong a mother could be about her own child. By late afternoon, I'd finished my ranch work and cleaned up for the church social. The whole territory seemed to turn out for these gatherings. Ranchers, homesteaders, miners from up the mountain, and even some of the Ute folk who'd made peace with living near the white settlements. It was one of the few times our scattered community came together, and I always looked forward to seeing neighbors I might not encounter for weeks at a time. I rode Thunder into town just as the sun was settling behind the western peaks. The small wooden church sat at the center of our settlement, with lanterns already glowing warm in the windows. Wagons and horses filled the area around the building, and I could hear the low murmur of conversation and occasional laughter drifting out into the evening air. "Eleanor," Martha called from near the church steps, waving me over. She'd changed into her good blue dress, the one she saved for Sundays and special occasions. "I was hoping you'd make it." I tied Thunder to the hitching post and smoothed my own dress, a simple brown wool that Thomas had always said brought out the color of my eyes. As I walked toward the church, folks nodded and called out greetings. Old Pete from the mining claim tipped his hat. The Hendersons, who ran the dry goods store, smiled and made room for me on the steps. This acceptance hadn't come easy in the early years. When Thomas first brought me to this settlement, some folks weren't sure what to make of a half-Ute woman trying to fit into their community. But time and honest dealing had worn down most of the suspicion. I paid my bills, helped neighbors in hard times, and never gave anyone cause for complaint. Respect had to be earned on the frontier. But once earned, it held firm. Inside the church, the wooden pews had been pushed back to make room for tables laden with food. The women had outdone themselves: roasted chicken, fresh bread, apple pies, and preserves that would see families through the winter months ahead. The men clustered near the back, talking cattle prices and weather, while children ran between the tables until their mothers called them to order. I found myself in conversation with Running Bear, one of the Ute elders who sometimes attended these gatherings. He was a man of perhaps 60 winters, with silver-streaked hair braided down his back and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd seen two worlds collide and learned to walk between them. "Your son comes tonight?" he asked in the careful English he'd learned from the missionary teachers. "I believe so," I replied, switching to the Ute tongue my mother had taught me. "He has news to share." Running Bear nodded thoughtfully. "The young ones often forget the old ways when they choose new paths, but the blood remembers what the mind forgets." His words carried more weight than simple conversation, and I found myself wondering what he might have observed about Samuel that I'd missed. Running Bear had always been perceptive about people's true nature, a skill that had kept his band alive during the difficult years when the government was moving tribes onto reservations. The sound of wheels on the dirt road outside caught everyone's attention. Through the open church doors, I could see a wagon approaching, and my heart quickened as I recognized Samuel's team of horses. He was finally here, ready to share whatever news had him asking about celebration supplies. But as the wagon drew closer, something in the way Samuel sat, stiff and formal, made me uneasy. Beside him sat Rebecca, dressed in what looked like a new white dress. Her blonde hair pinned up in a style I'd seen on the Eastern ladies who sometimes passed through on the railroad. She looked beautiful, but there was something cold in her posture and something that reminded me of a hawk surveying territory it meant to claim. Samuel climbed down from the wagon and helped Rebecca descend, his movements careful and deliberate. When they walked through the church doors, the conversation gradually quieted as people turned to see what news the young couple might bring. "Folks," Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the room with an authority I'd rarely heard from him. "Rebecca and I have an announcement to make." I moved closer, my heart beating faster with anticipation. This was the moment I'd been hoping for. Samuel finally ready to share his happiness with the community that had watched him grow up, ready to formally introduce the woman who would be part of our family. Rebecca stepped forward, her hand resting on Samuel's arm in a gesture that looked possessive rather than affectionate. Her pale blue eyes swept across the gathered crowd, and when they found mine, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the warmth of a daughter-in-law greeting her husband's mother. It was the calculating look of someone measuring an obstacle. "We wanted you all to know," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent church, "that Samuel and I were married yesterday at my family's farm." The words hit me like a physical blow. Married, yesterday, while I'd been sitting at my kitchen table, Moorish counting the money I'd sent them and imagining being part of their celebration. They'd already held their wedding without me. "It was a small ceremony," Samuel added, his eyes avoiding mine completely. "Just immediate family and close friends." The silence in the church was deafening. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning to look at me, measuring my reaction, wondering how a mother could be excluded from her only son's wedding. The shame burned through me like fire. But underneath it was something colder and harder, the first stirring of real anger. Running Bear's weathered hand touched my shoulder gently, a gesture of support that somehow made the humiliation even sharper. Here was a man who barely knew me offering comfort, while my own son stood 20 feet away acting as if I were a stranger. Rebecca smiled then, a smile that never reached her eyes. And I realized with crystal clarity that this moment had been planned. She'd wanted me here, wanted the whole community to witness my exclusion, wanted everyone to understand exactly where I stood in her new family structure. The celebration I'd imagined, the joy I'd anticipated, the family bonds I'd hoped to strengthen, all of it crumbled in that moment like a house built on sand. I didn't stay for the rest of the social. Couldn't bear to watch folks trying to make conversation while pretending they hadn't just witnessed a son cast aside his own mother like yesterday's trash. The congratulations and well wishes for Samuel and Rebecca felt like salt in an open wound, so I slipped out the back of the church while they were still accepting handshakes and forced smiles. Thunder sensed my mood the moment I untied his reins. Horses always know when something's wrong with their riders. And this old gelding had carried me through enough troubles over the years to recognize the signs. I mounted up without a word to anyone and turned toward home, letting him pick his own pace through the gathering darkness. The ride back to the ranch gave me time to think, though thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. The night air was sharp with the promise of frost, and overhead the stars were coming out one by one in the clear mountain sky. This country had always been my refuge when life got complicated, but tonight even the familiar landscape couldn't ease the ache in my chest. Married yesterday. The words kept repeating in my head like a preacher stuck on the same verse. While I'd been planning what gift to give them, they'd already stood before a minister and spoken their vows. While I'd been imagining myself in the front row, watching my boy become a husband, they'd deliberately chosen to exclude me from the most important day of his life. But it was more than just missing the ceremony that cut so deep. It was the way Rebecca had looked at me when she made the announcement, like she was delivering a message meant specifically for my ears. It was the way Samuel had avoided my eyes, as if he couldn't bear to see what his news would do to me. And it was the realization that this hadn't been some sudden decision. This had been planned, calculated, designed to put me in my place. Thunder's hooves found their rhythm on the familiar trail, and I let my mind wander back over the past 2 years. When had Samuel started changing toward me? When had the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings become this stranger who could humiliate me in front of the whole community? I thought about the money I'd been sending. $3,000 over 2 years, more than most folks in the territory saw in 5 years of hard work. Every time they'd asked, I'd found a way to help. Samuel's crop failed. I sent $50. Rebecca needed medicine. I sent $30. Their roof leaked. I sent enough to fix it twice over. And what had I gotten in return? Awkward conversations when we met in town. Brief, uncomfortable visits where Rebecca barely spoke to me and Samuel seemed eager to leave. No invitations to Sunday dinner. No requests for my advice about married life. No acknowledgement that I might want to be part of their new beginning. The truth was starting to settle in my bones like winter cold. I hadn't been helping my son build a life. I'd been paying for the privilege of being ignored. Every dollar I'd sent had been a small bribe, a desperate attempt to buy my way back into Samuel's affections. And Rebecca had seen that desperation from the start, had known exactly how to use it. Thunder picked his way carefully down the slope toward the ranch, his sure feet finding purchase on the rocky ground. In the distance, I could see the warm glow of lamplight from my kitchen window. Martha must have stopped by to check on the place while I was in town. The sight of home should have comforted me, but tonight it just reminded me of how empty the house would feel. I'd spent years imagining grandchildren running through those rooms, holiday dinners with Samuel and his wife, the kind of family gatherings that would fill the silence Thomas's death had left behind. Now I could see those dreams for what they really were, foolish hopes built on nothing more substantial than a mother's love and an old woman's loneliness. As I unsaddled Thunder and rubbed him down for the night, my hands moved automatically through the familiar routine while my mind kept working. The pattern was clear once I stopped making excuses for it. Every interaction with Samuel and Rebecca had been about money. Every visit had ended with a request for help. Every letter had contained some mention of their financial troubles. I told myself I was being a good mother, supporting my son as he started his adult life. But good mothers got invited to their children's weddings. Good mothers got treated with respect and affection, not like inconvenient creditors who needed to be managed and appeased. The barn was quiet except for the soft sounds of the horses settling for the night. I stood there in the darkness, breathing in the familiar smells of hay and leather and honest work, trying to make sense of what had happened to my family. When had love become a transaction? When had my son learned to see me as nothing more than a source of funds? And Rebecca, I could see her hand in all of this now, the way she'd steered conversations toward their financial problems whenever I was around, the way she'd mentioned, seemingly in passing, how other families helped their children get established, the way she'd made me feel guilty for having money when they were struggling. She'd played me like a fiddle, and I'd been too blind with maternal love to see it happening. Walking back toward the house, I made my first real decision since hearing that devastating announcement. Tomorrow, I would ride into town and visit the territorial office where I kept my accounts, not to send more money to Samuel and Rebecca, but to look at exactly how much I'd given them and what I had left. It was time to stop thinking like a desperate mother and start thinking like a woman who'd been taken advantage of long enough. The kitchen was warm when I stepped inside, and sure enough, Martha had left a pot of coffee on the stove and a note saying she'd fed the chickens. Good neighbors were worth their weight in gold on the frontier, and Martha had proven herself time and again. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where I'd counted out so many payments to Samuel and Rebecca. The ledger was still open from this morning, its pages filled with the careful records of my generosity. But looking at those numbers now, I didn't see love anymore. I saw the price of my own foolishness. I woke before dawn with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The decision to examine my finances properly had settled in my mind overnight like sediment in a clear stream, and this morning I knew exactly what needed doing. After feeding the stock and leaving instructions for Miguel, I saddled Thunder and rode into town with my ledger tucked safely in my saddlebags. The county clerk's office sat on Main Street next to the land recorder's building, a sturdy log structure that housed the various clerks and officials who kept track of the county's business. Mr. Henderson, the county clerk who'd been handling my accounts since Thomas died, looked up with surprise when I walked through his door. Mrs. McKinnon, he said, rising from his desk. Wasn't expecting to see you today. Everything all right at the ranch? That's what I aimed to find out. Mr. Henderson, I replied, setting my ledger on his desk. I need to go through every transaction I've made over the past 2 years. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every payment I've authorized. He studied my face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read trouble in people's expressions. After 20 years of handling other folks' money, he'd probably seen every kind of financial disaster the county had to offer. Of course. Ma'am, let me pull your records. While he rummaged through his wooden filing drawers, I opened my own ledger to the pages where I'd been tracking the money I'd sent to Samuel and Rebecca. The numbers looked even worse in the harsh morning light streaming through the office windows. Mr. Henderson returned with a thick folder and spread the contents across his desk. Bank drafts, entries from the banker's book, money order receipts, 2 years' worth of my financial dealings laid out like evidence in a court case. Now then, he said, adjusting his spectacles. What exactly are we looking for? I want to know how much money I've sent to my son Samuel over the past 2 years, every penny. We worked through the records methodically. Mr. Henderson reading from his official documents while I cross-referenced them with my own careful notes. The pattern that emerged was worse than I'd feared. $50 in March of '83, Mr. Henderson read. 35 in April, 20 in May, 60 in June. The amounts varied, but the frequency was relentless. Nearly every month for 2 years. Sometimes twice a month when Rebecca claimed some emergency or Samuel wrote about unexpected expenses. I'd been so focused on each individual request that I'd never stepped back to see the larger picture. August of '84. Mr. Henderson continued. $100. That was a large bank draft. Mrs. McKinnon, I remember asking if you were sure about it. I remembered too. Rebecca had claimed she needed surgery in Denver. Some female complaint that required a specialist. I'd sent the money without question, grateful that Samuel had married a woman who would confide in me about such personal matters. September, another 75, October, 40, November. The list went on, each entry a small cut that had bled me slowly but surely. When we finally reached the end, Mr. Henderson sat back and whistled low. Mrs. McKinnon, by my count, you've sent your son and his wife a total of $3,240 over the past 24 months. The number hit me like a physical blow. $3,240, more than most families in the county earned in 5 years of backbreaking work, enough to buy a good-sized ranch, or cattle enough to stock one, or send a dozen children back east for proper schooling. That's more than I thought, I managed to say. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his expression concerned. Mrs. McKinnon, I don't mean to pry, but that's a substantial sum. Has your son been having serious financial difficulties? I thought about Samuel's farm, the small plot of land he'd claimed when he came of age. It wasn't the best soil in the county, but it was decent enough for a man willing to work hard, and I'd seen him in town often enough, never looking particularly desperate or threadbare. I thought he was, I said slowly, but now I'm not so sure. Mr. Henderson pulled out another set of records. I handle accounts for most of the businesses in town. Mrs. McKinnon, if you don't mind me asking, has your son mentioned any particular debts or obligations? Rebecca said they owed money to various folks. The doctor, the general store, suppliers for their farm. He nodded thoughtfully and began sorting through his papers. Let me check something. Your son, Samuel McKinnon, married to Rebecca. What was her maiden name? Coleman. Rebecca Coleman. From back east somewhere. Mr. Henderson's expression grew more serious as he searched through his files. Mrs. McKinnon, I've been handling accounts in this county for 20 years, and I know most of the substantial debts folks carry. I don't show any major obligations for your son with any of the local businesses. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. What do you mean? I mean that if Samuel owed significant money to the doctor, the general store, or any of the suppliers I work with, I'd have records of it. Most folks around here settle their accounts through this office, especially for larger sums. The implications of his words began to sink in. If Samuel wasn't carrying the debts Rebecca had described, where had all my money gone? What had they been doing with $3,000 that hadn't gone toward paying legitimate expenses? There's something else. Mrs. McKinnon, Mr. Henderson said, his voice careful and quiet. I've heard talk around town about your son and his wife. Nothing malicious. You understand, just the usual gossip that makes the rounds. What kind of talk? Well, they've been seen in Denver quite regular-like, taking the train up there, staying at the nice hotels, eating at the fancy restaurants. And Rebecca's been ordering a lot of goods from back east, dresses, furniture, things that cost considerable money. The picture was becoming clearer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. While I'd been scrimping and saving, worried about their supposed financial hardships, Samuel and Rebecca had been living high on my money, the emergency medical expenses, the failed crops, the urgent repairs. All of it had been lies designed to keep the money flowing. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I want to change how my accounts are handled. From now on, no transfers or bank drafts without my personal signature on the paperwork. And I want to be notified immediately if anyone tries to access my funds. He nodded approvingly. That's wise, Mrs. McKinnon. I should have suggested it sooner, but I assumed it was all legitimate family business. As I gathered up my papers and prepared to leave, one more thought occurred to me. Mr. Henderson, you mentioned seeing them in Denver regularly. How often would you say? Oh, at least once a month for the past year, sometimes more. Your daughter-in-law seems particularly fond of the shopping there. The train makes it easy enough, and they always seem to have money for the tickets. Once a month. The same frequency as their requests for money. The same timing as their carefully crafted sob stories about emergencies and unexpected expenses. I walked out of that office with my ledger tucked under my arm and a burning anger in my chest that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. $3,240, 2 years of lies, and a daughter-in-law who'd been playing me for a fool from the very beginning, but the anger felt good. It felt clean and sharp and purposeful, like a blade that had finally found its proper edge. It was time to put that blade to use. The anger burned in me all the way home from the county clerk's office. But by the time I reached the ranch, something else had taken its place, a need for counsel that went deeper than what any white neighbor could provide. The betrayal I discovered wasn't just about money, it was about family, about respect, about the bonds that should hold people together even when times got hard. I knew where to find the wisdom I needed. Running Bear's band had their winter camp about 5 miles north of my ranch, in a sheltered valley where the creek ran year-round and the cottonwoods provided windbreak from the mountain storms. The government had tried to move them onto the reservation years back, but Running Bear was too smart and too respected to be pushed around easily. He'd found ways to keep his people on their traditional lands, and the local authorities had learned it was easier to leave them be than to fight a battle they couldn't win. I'd visited the camp before, usually to trade goods or seek Running Bear's advice about matters the white world couldn't help me understand. My mother's blood gave me the right to approach, and my years of respectful dealing had earned me welcome there. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees when I rode into the camp. Children playing near the creek looked up and called out greetings in Ute, their voices bright with recognition. A few of the women nodded to me from where they worked scraping hides or tending cook fires. This was a community that knew how to read people, and they could see in my face that I'd come seeking more than casual conversation. Running Bear sat outside his lodge, working on a bridle with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 60 years perfecting his craft. His gray hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his weathered hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who found peace in useful work. "Grandmother," he said in Ute, using the term of respect for an older woman. "You carry heavy thoughts today." I dismounted and approached with the proper courtesy my mother had taught me. "Uncle," I replied, using the reciprocal term of respect. "I need counsel from someone who understands the old ways." He set aside his work and gestured for me to sit on the buffalo robe spread beside him. "Tell me what troubles you." I told him everything. The years of sending money to Samuel, the secret wedding that excluded me, the discovery of how they'd been living in Denver while claiming poverty. I spoke in English mostly, switching to Ute when I needed words that carried deeper meaning than the white language could provide. Running Bear listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on my face with the kind of attention that made me feel truly heard. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, considering my words with the care they deserved. "Among our people," he said finally, "when a child takes from the parent but gives nothing back, we say the child has forgotten the sacred relationship. The parent gives life, protection, teaching. The child owes respect, care in old age, continuation of the family honor. But Samuel is my only child," I said. "If I cut him off completely, what happens to our family line?" Running Bear picked up a piece of leather from his work and held it toward the firelight. "See this hide? It was once part of a strong buffalo. But if I do not treat it properly, if I let it rot or tear, it becomes worthless. Better to cut away the bad part and save what can be saved than to lose everything." His words carried the weight of generations of survival wisdom. The Ute had endured by knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to fight and when to walk away. "Your son's wife," he continued, "she does not see you as family. She sees you as, what is the white word? Resource on it, like a mine to be dug until empty. And Samuel goes along with it. The young man has forgotten his mother's teachings. He has chosen the path of taking without giving. This is not the way of either of our peoples, white or Ute." A woman approached from one of the nearby lodges, carrying a wooden bowl of stew. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone used to caring for others. Running Bear accepted the bowl with a nod of thanks. My daughter. Singing Bird, he said to me in English. She lost her husband 2 winters ago. Now she cares for her children and also for me and her mother. She works hard, but she does not forget respect. Singing Bird smiled at me and spoke in Ute. Running Bear translated, she says she has heard of your troubles from the women who trade in town. She says many white children forget their duties to parents. But this does not make it right. What would your people do in this situation? I asked. Running Bear considered this carefully. In the old days, we would call a council. The elders would hear both sides and decide what was just. But your son and his wife would not respect such a council. They follow only the white man's law now. Then what can I do? You can remember that you are not just a mother. You are also a woman with her own path to walk. Your mother's people believe that when someone takes your generosity and throws it back as insult, you have the right to protect yourself. He handed me the bowl of stew, and I accepted it gratefully. The food was simple but nourishing, flavored with wild herbs that reminded me of my mother's cooking. There is something else, Running Bear said after I'd eaten. Your son's wife. I have seen her in town. She speaks of you to others with no respect. She tells people that you are difficult, that you try to control their lives with money. This revelation hit me like a slap. Not only had Rebecca been stealing from me, she'd been poisoning my reputation in the community. What does she say exactly, Hal? That you are a lonely old woman who uses money to force attention? That she and your son only tolerate your gifts because they feel sorry for you? The cruelty of it took my breath away. While I'd been worrying about their welfare, Rebecca had been portraying me as a pathetic figure to be pitied rather than respected. Uncle, I said, I want to stop sending them money, but I'm afraid Samuel will never speak to me again. Running Bear looked at me with eyes that had seen the destruction of his people's way of life and their struggle to rebuild something new. Granddaughter, he said gently, when did your son last speak to you with love instead of need? I tried to remember and couldn't. Every conversation in recent years had centered around their problems, their needs, their requests for help. A relationship built on fear is not a relationship, he continued. It is a trap. Better to be alone with dignity than surrounded by people who see you as useful rather than loved. As the sun set behind the mountains, I sat with Running Bear and his family around their fire. The conversation turned to other matters, the weather, the health of the horses, plans for the coming winter, but underneath it all, I felt something settling in my heart. I had been thinking like a desperate mother instead of a wise woman. It was time to change that. When I finally rose to leave, Running Bear walked me to my horse. Remember, he said, strength is not always about holding on. Sometimes strength is knowing when to let go. I rode home through the darkness with his words echoing in my mind and a new sense of purpose growing in my chest. The anger was still there, but it was tempered now with something more powerful. The calm determination of a woman who finally understood her own worth. I rode to Samuel's farm the next morning with my ledger and my saddlebags, and Running Bear's wisdom fresh in my mind. The small homestead sat in a valley about 3 miles east of town, a modest spread that should have been able to support 2 able-bodied adults without constant help from anyone else. But as I approached the house, I could see signs of the prosperity my money had bought them. New curtains hung in the windows, expensive-looking fabric that hadn't come from the local dry goods store. A fancy buggy sat beside the barn, its paint fresh and its brass fittings gleaming in the morning sun. Even the front porch had been expanded and fitted with carved railings that must have cost more than most folks made in a month. Samuel was splitting wood behind the house when I rode up. He looked surprised to see me, and something that might have been guilt flickered across his face before he composed himself into a welcoming smile. "Morning, Ma," he called, setting down his axe. "Wasn't expecting you today." "I imagine you weren't," I replied, dismounting and tying Thunder to the hitching post. "Is Rebecca inside?" She's resting. Had one of her headaches come on this morning." I'd heard about Rebecca's convenient headaches before. They seemed to strike whenever there was work to be done or uncomfortable conversations to be had. "Well, she can rest later. Right now, I need to talk to both of you." Samuel's expression grew wary. "Ma, if this is about the wedding again, I told you it was just a small ceremony. We didn't mean any offense. Go get your wife." "Samuel." Something in my voice must have warned him that this wasn't a conversation he could avoid. He went into the house and returned a few minutes later with Rebecca, who looked perfectly healthy despite her supposed headache. She'd taken time to fix her hair and put on one of her better dresses, a blue silk that I was fairly certain had come from Denver. "Eleanor," she said with that false sweetness she always used with me. "What a lovely surprise. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you. What I'd like is some honest answers." I pulled my ledger from my saddlebag and opened it to the pages where I'd been tracking their requests for money. Both Samuel and Rebecca's eyes fixed on the book like it was a snake coiled to strike. "I spent yesterday morning at the county clerk's office," I began, "going through every penny I've sent you over the past 2 years. Would you like to know what I found?" Neither of them answered, but I could see the tension building in their faces. $3,240. That's what I've given you since you got married. Money I sent because you told me you were struggling, because you claimed to have debts you couldn't pay, because Rebecca here said she needed medical treatment. "Ma," Samuel started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. Mr. Henderson was kind enough to check his records for any substantial debts you might owe around town. Funny thing, he couldn't find any. No outstanding bills with the doctor, no unpaid accounts at the general store, no money owed to suppliers or anyone else." Rebecca's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin with defiance. "We had expenses you wouldn't understand. Eleanor, running a farm isn't easy." "You're right about that," I agreed. "Running a farm isn't easy. But taking monthly trips to Denver, staying in fancy hotels, and buying expensive clothes, that's not farming. That's living high on someone else's money." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel stared at his boots while Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "How did you—" Rebecca began, then stopped herself. "How did I find out? Because people talk, Rebecca, and because I finally got smart enough to ask the right questions." I closed the ledger and looked directly at my son. "Samuel, I raised you better than this. Your father would be ashamed to see what you've become." That got a reaction. Samuel's head snapped up, his face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare bring Pa into this. He's been dead for years. And if he were alive, you'd never have gotten away with treating me like your personal bank account." Rebecca stepped forward, her false sweetness replaced by something much uglier. "You gave us that money freely, Eleanor. We never forced you to send it. No, you just lied to get it. Emergency medical bills that never existed. Failed crops that I can see are thriving just fine. Desperate poverty while you live better than most folks in the county." "We deserve to live well," Rebecca snapped. "We're young and we work hard. Just because you're content to live like some old hermit on that ranch doesn't mean we have to." The mask was finally off. This was the real Rebecca, not the sweet, grateful daughter-in-law she pretended to be, but a greedy, entitled woman who saw my generosity as her right. "You're correct about one thing," I said calmly. "I did give you that money freely, but that's done now. There won't be any more." Samuel found his voice at last. "Ma, you can't just cut us off. We have obligations, plans. We're counting on your help. Plans you made with my money without asking me. Obligations you took on assuming I'd always be there to pay for them." I tucked the ledger back into my saddlebag. "Well, I won't be. From now on, you'll have to live within your own means." Rebecca's composure cracked completely. "You can't do this to us. We're family." "Family." I repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "When did you last treat me like family?" "Rebecca, when did you invite me for Sunday dinner? When did you ask about my health or my happiness? When did you show me any consideration that wasn't connected to money?" She had no answer for that, and we all knew it. "You excluded me from your wedding because I wasn't special enough to be there. Fine. Now you can live without my special help." I mounted thunder and looked down at them both, my son who'd chosen greed over honor, and his wife who taught him that love could be bought and sold. "Samuel," I said, "when you're ready to be my son again instead of my creditor, you know where to find me, but it'll be on terms of respect, not money." I rode away without looking back, leaving them standing in their fancy yard surrounded by the things my money had bought. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe freely. The confrontation was over, but I had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. I was barely through my front gate when I saw Martha's horse tied at my hitching post. She must have seen me riding back from Samuel's place and come over to hear what had happened. News traveled fast in our small community, and Martha had always been able to read trouble in people's faces better than most. She was waiting on my porch with 2 cups of coffee already poured, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. I dismounted and took the offered cup, grateful for both the coffee and the company. About as well as you'd expect when you tell someone their free money is drying up. They didn't take it well. Then, Rebecca showed her true colors, and Samuel chose his wife over his mother. The words hurt to say, but they were true. I told them the money stops now. No more payments. No more emergency funds. No more treating me like their personal bank. Martha nodded approvingly. Good for you, Eleanor. It was past time. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun climb higher over the eastern mountains. But I could tell Martha had more on her mind than just checking on my welfare. There's something you should know, she said finally. I was in town yesterday after you left the county clerk's office. Rebecca was there too, talking to anyone who'd listen. My stomach tightened. What was she saying? Telling folks that you've become, difficult. That you're trying to control their lives with money. And when they stood up to you, you got vindictive. Martha's expression darkened. She's painting herself as the victim, Eleanor, making it sound like you're the unreasonable one. I'd expected this, but it still stung. Rebecca was smart enough to know that controlling the story was half the battle, and she'd gotten her version out first. Who was listening to her? Some of the newer folks in town, people who don't know you well, but Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store set her straight pretty quick. Told Rebecca that you've been nothing but generous and honest in all your dealings, and maybe she should look to her own behavior before casting stones. That was some comfort, at least. The people who'd known me longest weren't buying Rebecca's lies. There's more, Martha continued. I stopped by the church on my way home. Pastor Williams was there, and he mentioned that Rebecca had been to see him too, asked him about the proper Christian response to elderly relatives who become, he said she used the word troublesome. The audacity of it took my breath away. Rebecca was trying to turn my own community against me, using my age and my generosity as weapons. What did Pastor Williams say? He told her that honoring one's elders was a commandment, not a suggestion, and that he'd be happy to counsel both her and Samuel about their Christian duties to family. Martha smiled grimly. I don't think that was the response she was hoping for. A horse and rider appeared on the road leading to my ranch. As they got closer, I recognized Tom Henderson, Martha's eldest son. He worked as a deputy sheriff and had always been a steady, reliable young man. Afternoon, Mrs. McKinnon, Ma, he said, dismounting and tipping his hat. Mind if I sit for a minute? Got something you might want to hear. Martha made room for him on the porch steps. Tom was a man who chose his words carefully, so when he had something to say, it was usually worth hearing. I was at the sheriff's office this morning when your son came in, he began. He was asking Sheriff Morrison about what legal rights he might have regarding your property and finances. The words hit me like a physical blow. Samuel was already looking for ways to force me to keep supporting them. What did Sheriff Morrison tell him? Told him the truth. That as long as you're of sound mind and not under any kind of duress, your money is your own to do with as you please. Said the law doesn't require parents to support grown children, especially married ones. That was a relief, but I could see there was more. Samuel didn't like that answer much, Tom continued. Started talking about how you might not be thinking clearly, how the isolation of ranch life could affect an older person's judgment. Sheriff Morrison shut that down real quick. Said he'd seen you in town plenty of times and you seemed sharper than most folks half your age. So Samuel was already trying to question my mental competence, just like in the original story I'd heard. But this time, I was prepared for it. There's something else, Tom said, and after Samuel left, Sheriff Morrison asked me to ride out and give you a heads up. He's concerned that your son and his wife might try to cause you trouble, and he wants you to know that the law is on your side as long as you're acting within your rights. Which I am, absolutely. But Sheriff Morrison also wanted me to tell you that if they start harassing you or making threats, you should report it immediately. He won't tolerate anyone trying to intimidate an honest citizen, family or not. Martha reached over and squeezed my hand. You've got more support than you know. Eleanor, the people who matter in this community know what kind of person you are. As if to prove her point, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one I recognized as Jake Peterson, who ran the feed store in town. He rode up with the purposeful air of a man on a mission. Mrs. McKinnon, he called, dismounting. Hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Wanted to have a word with you about something. Of course, Jake. What's on your mind? Well, I was in my store this morning when your daughter-in-law came in. She was asking about extending credit for some supplies. Said you'd be good for the payment as always. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Thing is, after she left, I got to thinking about some things I'd heard, and I wanted to check with you directly before I extended any credit in your name. Smart man? Rebecca was already trying to use my reputation to get goods she couldn't pay for. Jake, I appreciate you checking with me, but I want to be clear. I'm no longer responsible for any debts or purchases made by my son or his wife. If they want credit, they'll have to qualify for it on their own. He nodded with obvious relief. That's what I figured, but I wanted to hear it from you directly. I'll make sure the other merchants in town know the situation too, if that's all right with you. I'd be grateful for that. As Jake rode away, I realized that Rebecca's attempts to poison the community against me were backfiring. Instead of turning people against me, her behavior was making the honest folks in town more protective of me. You know what this means, don't you? Martha said after we'd watched Jake disappear down the road. What? It means you've got an army of neighbors who've got your back. Rebecca can tell all the lies she wants, but actions speak louder than words around here. And your actions over the years have earned you more friends than she can count. Tom stood up and settled his hat back on his head. Ma's right, Mrs. McKinnon. You've got the whole community watching out for you now. Samuel and Rebecca are going to find out that trying to take advantage of a respected neighbor doesn't sit well with folks around here. As I watched Tom ride away to continue his rounds, I felt something I hadn't expected, a sense of belonging that went deeper than blood family. These people, my neighbors and friends, they'd chosen to stand with me based on who I was and how I'd lived my life. It was a better foundation than money could ever provide. 3 days after my confrontation with Samuel and Rebecca, I learned just how desperate they'd become. I was in the barn tending to a mare with a stone bruise when Miguel came running from the house, his face grim with worry. Senora Eleanor, he called. There are men at the house. They say they have papers for you. My heart sank. I'd been expecting something like this, but that didn't make it any easier to face. I wiped my hands on my work apron and walked to the house, where I found 2 men waiting on my porch. One I recognized as a clerk from the county courthouse. The other was a stranger in a dark suit who carried himself with the bearing of someone used to delivering bad news. Mrs. McKinnon, the courthouse clerk said, touching his hat respectfully. I'm sorry to bother you, but we have some legal papers that need to be served. The stranger stepped forward and handed me a folded document. Ma'am, I'm John Crawford, attorney at law. I've been retained by your son Samuel McKinnon and his wife Rebecca to represent them in a matter concerning your mental competency. The words hit me like a slap, even though I'd been half expecting them. Samuel was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, just like in that story I'd heard. But this time, I was ready for the fight. My mental competency, I asked, keeping my voice steady. On what grounds? Crawford cleared his throat and consulted his papers. Your son and daughter-in-law have filed a petition claiming that you've shown erratic behavior, made irrational financial decisions, and may be suffering from the effects of advanced age and isolation. Erratic behavior like refusing to give them more money. Ma'am, I'm just here to serve the papers. You'll need to appear before Judge Harrison next week to respond to these allegations. I took the papers and scanned them quickly. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was clear enough. Samuel and Rebecca were claiming I wasn't fit to manage my own affairs, and they wanted the court to appoint Samuel as my guardian. Mr. Crawford, I said, I assume you've been paid well for this work. He looked uncomfortable. My fees are between me and my clients. Ma'am, of course they are, and I'm sure my son and his wife have been very convincing about their concerns for my welfare. I folded the papers and tucked them into my apron pocket. Tell me, have you actually observed any of this alleged erratic behavior yourself? Well, no, but have you spoken to any of my neighbors, my banker, or anyone else who deals with me regularly? The court will determine what evidence is relevant. Mrs. McKinnon. After the men left, I sat on my porch and read through the legal papers more carefully. The petition was full of lies and half-truths, painting me as a confused old woman who'd been manipulated by unscrupulous neighbors into cutting off support for her loving family. It claimed I'd become paranoid and suspicious, unable to make rational decisions about my finances. The irony wasn't lost on me. Samuel and Rebecca were accusing me of the very behavior they'd been engaging in, manipulation and irrational thinking. I was still reading when Martha rode up, her face flushed with anger. Eleanor, I just heard what happened. That no-good son of yours is trying to have you declared incompetent. News travels fast. faster than Samuel probably hoped. Half the town is talking about it, and most folks are outraged. She dismounted and sat beside me on the porch steps. What are you going to do? Fight it. But I'll need help. You've got it. Tom's already talking to Sheriff Morrison about what kind of character witnesses you might need. And Pastor Williams is furious. He says he's never seen a clearer case of children dishonoring their parents. That afternoon, my porch became an impromptu meeting place as neighbor after neighbor stopped by to offer support. Jake Peterson brought a letter from the Merchants Association stating that I'd always been prompt and honest in all my business dealings. Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store came with a petition signed by 24 townspeople attesting to my good character and sound judgment. But it was Running Bear's visit that surprised me most. The old Ute elder rarely came to the ranch, preferring that I visit him at his camp when we needed to talk. But as evening approached, I saw him riding up the path to my house, his bearing as dignified as ever. "Uncle," I said, greeting him with proper respect. "This is an honor. I have heard of your troubles." "Granddaughter," he said in English and dismounting with the careful movements of a man his age. "I have come to offer the support of my people." We sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, and Running Bear explained what he'd learned from the Ute who traded in town. "Your son's wife has been telling people that you are influenced by the Indian ways, that this has made you strange and unreliable." His weathered face was calm, but I could see the anger in his dark eyes. "She thinks to use your mother's blood against you." This was a new low, even for Rebecca. She was trying to turn my mixed heritage into evidence of mental instability. "What she does not understand," Running Bear continued, "is that many of the white people in this valley have learned to respect our ways. They have seen that wisdom comes from many sources, not just one. Will you testify for me in court if the white man's court will hear an old Indian's words? Yes. I will tell them that you have always shown the wisdom of both your peoples, that your judgment has been sound and your heart strong." The next morning brought another surprise. Tom Henderson rode up with Sheriff Morrison himself, a man whose opinion carried considerable weight in the county. "Mrs. McKinnon," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, "I understand you're facing some legal troubles. My son seems to think I'm not capable of managing my own affairs." Sheriff Morrison snorted. "That's rich, coming from a man who's never managed to support himself without help from his mother." He pulled out a small notebook and consulted it. "I've been asking around town about you, ma'am. Wanted to get a clear picture before I made any statements to the court. And what did you find? That you're one of the most respected women in this county? You pay your bills on time. You help your neighbors when they're in need, and you run your ranch better than most men half your age." He put the notebook away. "I'll be happy to testify to that effect if needed." By the end of the week, I had more character witnesses than I knew what to do with, but I also had a clearer picture of what Samuel and Rebecca were up against. They'd underestimated the respect I'd earned in this community, and their desperate gambit was turning more people against them than it was helping their cause. The court hearing was set for the following Monday. As I prepared for what might be the most important fight of my life, I realized that Samuel and Rebecca had made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that because I was a woman, and an older one at that, I'd be easy to intimidate and control. They'd forgotten that I was a frontier woman who'd survived 40 years in hard country, who'd earned the respect of both my Anglo neighbors and my Ute relatives. They were about to learn the difference between an easy target and a woman with nothing left to lose. The morning after my community rally of support, I knew I needed more than just good intentions and character witnesses to win this legal battle. Samuel and Rebecca had hired a real lawyer, and I'd need professional help to match their strategy. Tom Henderson had recommended a lawyer in Denver, a man named William Morrison who specialized in protecting the rights of property owners against fraudulent claims. The train ride to Denver gave me time to organize my thoughts and the evidence I'd been gathering. In my leather satchel, I carried every scrap of documentation from the past 2 years' bank drafts, letters from Samuel and Rebecca requesting money, receipts for goods I'd purchased for them, and my own careful ledger tracking every transaction. Morrison's office sat above a dry goods store on Larimer Street, in the busy commercial area where Denver's merchants and professional men conducted their business. The lawyer himself was a man of perhaps 40 years, with graying temples and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested he'd seen every variety of legal trickery the territory had to offer. "Mrs. McKinnon," he said after I'd explained my situation, "I've handled several cases like this in recent years. Unfortunately, it's becoming more common for adult children to challenge their parents' competency when the money stops flowing. What are my chances of winning? Better than you might think, especially given the evidence you've brought me. He spread my documents across his desk, studying them with the practiced eye of someone who understood the legal significance of every piece of paper. The key to your defense, Morrison continued, will be demonstrating three things. First, that you are completely mentally competent. Second, that your decision to cut off financial support was rational and justified. And third, that your son and daughter-in-law's motivations are financial rather than based on genuine concern for your welfare. Over the next 3 hours, we went through every detail of my case. Morrison asked probing questions about my daily routine, my business dealings, my relationships with neighbors, and my reasons for each financial decision I'd made. Tell me about this mixed heritage issue, he said. Your son's lawyer will likely try to use it against you, suggesting that it makes you somehow unstable or unreliable. My mother was Ute. My father was Anglo. I was raised to respect both cultures and take the best from each. It's made me stronger, not weaker. Good. We'll turn that argument on its head. Your ability to navigate between two cultures demonstrates adaptability and wisdom, not instability. He made notes in his careful script. Now, about these financial transactions, I want you to walk me through each one, explaining exactly what you were told and what you believed at the time. The process was exhausting, but necessary. By the time we finished, Morrison had a complete picture of how Samuel and Rebecca had systematically deceived me over 2 years. Mrs. McKinnon, he said finally, you've been the victim of what amounts to a confidence game, a deliberate scheme to defraud you of your money by exploiting your parental affections. In your case, it's been particularly well documented. Can we prove that in court? With the evidence you've provided and the witnesses you've described, absolutely. But we need to be prepared for their strategy. They'll try to paint you as a confused, lonely old woman who's being manipulated by neighbors and lawyers. They'll claim your decision to cut them off was irrational and vindictive. Morrison pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began outlining our defense strategy. First, we'll establish your mental competency through medical examination. I know a physician here in Denver who's well respected for his understanding of mental capacity and is often consulted by the courts. Second, we'll demonstrate the systematic nature of their deception through your financial records. Third, we'll present character witnesses who can testify to your sound judgment and rational behavior. What about the cultural angle? We'll present your mixed heritage as an asset, not a liability. Your ability to maintain relationships with both Anglo and Ute communities demonstrates social competence and wisdom. We might even call some of your Ute friends as witnesses to your character and judgment. The medical examination Morrison arranged took place the next morning. Dr. James Mitchell was a physician who'd been practicing in Denver for over 15 years, and his opinion carried weight with judges throughout the territory. Mrs. McKinnon, he said after examining me thoroughly and testing my memory, reasoning, and general mental function. You show no signs of mental decline or impairment. Your mind is as sharp as any woman's half your age, and your responses to my questions show clear thinking and sound judgment. Will you testify to that effect in court? Absolutely. In fact, based on what you've told me about your situation, I'd say your decision to protect yourself from further exploitation shows excellent judgment and strong mental health. Back in Morrison's office that afternoon, we refined our strategy further. He'd been busy while I was with Dr. Mitchell, sending telegrams to Colorado and gathering additional information about Samuel and Rebecca's activities. Interesting developments, he said, showing me several telegrams. I've been in touch with merchants in your area. It seems your daughter-in-law has been quite active in trying to establish credit using your name and reputation. Several businesses have received inquiries from her about extending credit with you as guarantor, without my knowledge or permission. Exactly. This demonstrates ongoing fraudulent behavior, not just past deception. It shows they fully intended to continue exploiting you financially. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing my testimony. Morrison coached me on how to present my story clearly and calmly, how to respond to hostile questioning, and how to demonstrate my competence through my answers. Remember, he said, the judge will be watching not just what you say, but how you say it. Stay calm, answer directly, and don't let their lawyer provoke you into anger. Your composure will be as important as your words. As the train carried me back to Colorado that evening, I felt more confident than I had since this nightmare began. I had professional legal representation, medical documentation of my competency, and a clear strategy for defending myself. But more than that, I had something Samuel and Rebecca didn't have: the truth. And in a courtroom, with the right preparation and presentation, the truth was a powerful weapon. The legal battle ahead would be difficult, but I was ready for it. I'd spent 2 years learning hard lessons about family, money, and manipulation. Now it was time to put those lessons to use in the fight for my freedom and dignity. Tomorrow, I would begin the final preparations for what might be the most important battle of my life. I returned from Denver with a sense of purpose that felt like steel in my backbone. The train pulled into our small station just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of forge fire. Martha was waiting for me on the platform, her face anxious with worry and hope. "How did it go?" she asked before I'd even stepped down from the car. "Better than I dared hope," I replied, hefting my satchel full of legal papers and medical documents. "We have a real chance, Martha, a real chance to win this thing." The ride back to my ranch gave me time to fill Martha in on everything Morrison had told me. She listened with growing satisfaction as I described the legal strategy, the medical examination, and the evidence we'd compiled. "So what happens now?" she asked as we pulled into my yard. "Now we make sure every witness is ready to testify, and we prepare for the fight of our lives." Word of my return spread quickly through the community, and by the next morning, my kitchen table had become an unofficial headquarters for what Martha had started calling Eleanor's Army. Sheriff Morrison arrived first, followed by Jake Peterson, Pastor Williams, and Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store. "Mrs. McKinnon," the sheriff said, settling his hat on his knee. "I've been thinking about this case of yours. There's something you should know about your son and his wife's recent activities." I poured coffee for everyone and took my seat at the head of the table. "What kind of activities?" "Well, they've been making inquiries around town about your daily habits, your business dealings, trying to find folks who might testify that you've been acting strange or unreliable." Jake Peterson snorted. "They asked me if I'd ever seen you confused or forgetful when conducting business. I told them the only confusion I'd seen was their confusion about why their credit had been cut off. They approached me too," Pastor Williams added. "Wanted to know if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior during church services, if you seemed disoriented or spoke inappropriately. I informed them that you were one of the most attentive and thoughtful members of my congregation." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her expression grim. "They offered to pay me to testify that you'd been making odd purchases or forgetting what you'd ordered. When I refused, Rebecca suggested that perhaps I didn't understand how serious your condition had become. The audacity of it took my breath away. They weren't just trying to have me declared incompetent, they were actively trying to bribe witnesses to lie about my mental state." "Did any of them take their money?" I asked. "Not a soul," Sheriff Morrison replied firmly. "In fact, their behavior has convinced more people to support you. Word's gotten around about what they're trying to do, and folks are outraged." That afternoon, Running Bear arrived with 2 other Ute elders. They'd ridden down from their winter camp specifically to discuss their testimony in court. "Granddaughter," Running Bear said as we sat on my porch, "we have spoken with the tribal council about this matter. They have agreed that what your son and his wife are doing is not just wrong. It is an attack on the wisdom of elders, which our people hold sacred. Will the court listen to Ute testimony? Your lawyer believes they will, especially if we speak to your character and judgment over the years we have known you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There is something else. We have heard that your son's wife has been telling people that your Indian blood makes you unreliable, that mixing the races creates confusion of mind." The racist implications made my stomach turn. Rebecca was trying to use the prejudices of some white settlers against me. "What she does not understand," continued Spotted Eagle, one of the other elders, "is that many white people in this valley have learned to respect our ways. They have seen that wisdom comes from understanding different paths, not from following only one." Over the next 2 days, we refined our preparation. Morrison had sent detailed instructions about what each witness should emphasize in their testimony. The key was to present a consistent picture of my competence, my rational decision-making, and the systematic nature of Samuel and Rebecca's deception. Martha organized the character witnesses, making sure each person understood when and where to appear in court. Jake Peterson gathered written statements from other merchants who'd had dealings with me. Pastor Williams prepared to speak about my consistent involvement in church activities and my sound moral judgment. The most challenging preparation involved the financial evidence. Morrison had sent a detailed list of questions the opposing lawyer was likely to ask, trying to make my financial decisions seem irrational or vindictive. We went through each transaction, making sure I could explain clearly why I'd sent money and why I'd eventually stopped. The key, I told my assembled supporters, is to show that every decision I made was based on information I had at the time. When I thought Samuel and Rebecca were struggling, I helped them. When I discovered they were lying to me, I stopped helping them. That's not irrational, that's learning from experience. 2 days before the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Mitchell, the physician who'd examined me in Denver, had traveled to Colorado to review my case once more and to meet with some of my community supporters. Mrs. McKinnon, he said after speaking with Martha, Running Bear, and several others. I want you to know that my examination in Denver has been confirmed by everything I've observed here. You have a strong network of relationships. You're actively engaged in your community, and you demonstrate excellent judgment in your daily affairs. Any suggestion that you're mentally incompetent is not just wrong, it's ridiculous. The evening before the trial, my house was full of people who'd come to offer their final support. We didn't call it a party, the circumstances were too serious for celebration, but there was a sense of community solidarity that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to protect myself. Running Bear spoke for all of them when he stood and addressed the room. Tomorrow, we do not just defend Eleanor McKinnon, he said in his careful English. We defend the right of all elders to be treated with respect, the right of all people to protect themselves from those who would use love as a weapon, and the right of wisdom to triumph over greed. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in years, a woman who knew her own worth, who had people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide, and who was ready to fight for her dignity and freedom. Tomorrow would bring the most important battle of my life, but tonight, I was surrounded by an army of friends, neighbors, and allies who believed in me and were willing to stand up for what was right. I was as ready as I'd ever be. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass and a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains. I rose before sunrise, as I had every day for 40 years, but this morning felt different. Today wasn't just about my daily routine. It was about fighting for my right to live my life with dignity and respect. I dressed carefully in my best black wool dress, the one I'd worn to Thomas's funeral and to church on the most important Sundays. My hair was braided simply and pinned up in the style my mother had taught me, practical, neat, and dignified. If I was going to face my son and daughter-in-law in court, I'd do it looking like the respectable frontier woman I'd always been. Martha arrived just as I was finishing my coffee, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came a steady stream of wagons and riders, neighbors, friends, and supporters who'd come to accompany me to the courthouse. The sight of them gathering in my yard brought tears to my eyes, though I was determined not to let anyone see me cry on this day. Eleanor, Martha said, gripping my hands tightly. Half the counties turned out to support you. Look at this. I stepped onto my porch and saw what she meant. Jake Peterson was there with his wife and eldest son. The Hendersons had closed their store for the morning to be present. Pastor Williams sat in his buggy alongside 3 other families from the church. Even some of the miners from up in the hills had ridden down to show their support. But what moved me most was seeing Running Bear and 5 other Ute elders on horseback at the edge of my property. They were dressed in their finest clothes, beaded shirts, silver jewelry, and eagle feathers that caught the morning light. Their presence was a statement that this battle was about more than just one woman's fight against family exploitation. Uncle, I called to Running Bear and Ute, you honor me with your presence. Granddaughter, he replied, today we stand with you not just as friends, but as people who understand that wisdom must be protected from those who would destroy it for their own gain. Sheriff Morrison rode up as I was greeting the Ute elders. Mrs. McKinnon, he said, dismounting and approaching with official purpose. I've had word from the courthouse. Your son and his wife arrived in town last night with their lawyer. They've been making noise about how this whole proceeding is unnecessary, how they're just trying to help a confused old woman. Let them talk, I replied. Actions speak louder than words, and their actions over the past 2 years have spoken plenty loud. "There's something else," the sheriff continued. "Judge Harrison sent word that he's expecting a full courtroom today. Word spread throughout the county about this case, and folks are coming from as far as 50 miles away to see what happens." The journey to town became something like a procession. I rode Thunder at the front, with Martha beside me and Running Bear, and the other Ute elders flanking us. Behind us came wagon after wagon of supporters, ranchers, homesteaders, merchants, miners, and townspeople who'd known me for years and were willing to stand up for what was right. As we approached the courthouse, I could see that Sheriff Morrison had been right about the crowd. The building was surrounded by people, and more were arriving every minute. Some I recognized as friends and neighbors. Others were strangers who'd come out of curiosity or because they'd heard about the case and wanted to see justice done. But I also saw Samuel and Rebecca standing near the courthouse steps with their lawyer, Mr. Crawford. Samuel looked uncomfortable with all the attention, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his hat. Rebecca, on the other hand, just stood straight and defiant, as if she were the wronged party in all this. When Rebecca saw our procession approaching, her expression changed from defiance to something approaching fear. I don't think she'd expected the entire community to turn out in support of the woman she'd been trying to portray as a confused, friendless old lady. "Look at that," Martha murmured as we dismounted near the courthouse. "She's finally realizing what she's up against." The crowd parted respectfully as we approached the courthouse steps. People called out words of encouragement and support, but I could also feel the weight of their expectations. These folks had taken time from their work and their families to be here. They deserved to see justice done. Just before we entered the courthouse, Running Bear approached me one final time. "Remember, granddaughter," he said quietly, "you carry not just your own dignity into that courtroom, but the dignity of all who have been used by those they trusted. Speak your truth with a strong voice." Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls and in the back. I'd never seen so many people gathered in one place in our county, and the sight was both humbling and empowering. Judge Harrison took his place at the bench and surveyed the crowded room with obvious surprise. "I've been serving this county for 15 years, he announced, "and I've never seen such community interest in a legal proceeding. I want everyone to understand that this courtroom will be conducted with dignity and respect, regardless of how many people are present." As I took my seat at the front of the courtroom, with Morrison beside me and my supporters filling the rows behind me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died, the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone in this world. Samuel and Rebecca sat across the aisle with their lawyer, but they looked small and isolated compared to the wall of community support that surrounded me. Rebecca kept glancing back at the crowd, and I could see the growing realization in her eyes that her strategy of portraying me as a friendless, confused old woman had backfired completely. "Your Honor," Mr. Crawford began, standing to address the court, "my clients are here today out of genuine concern for Mrs. McKinnon's welfare. They believe she has been unduly influenced by certain members of this community and is no longer capable of making sound financial decisions." A low murmur of disapproval rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel for silence, but I could feel the anger of my supporters at Crawford's words. Morrison rose to respond. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of mental incompetence, but a case of systematic financial exploitation by family members who saw Mrs. McKinnon's generosity as an opportunity for personal gain. The evidence will show that my client's decision to protect herself was not only rational but necessary." As the legal proceedings began in earnest, I sat surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. Whatever happened in the next few hours, I knew I'd already won something more important than any legal victory. I'd won back my dignity, my self-respect, and my place in a community that truly cared about me. The battle was about to begin, but I was ready for it. The first witness Crawford called was Samuel, and watching my own son walk to the witness stand to lie under oath was one of the most painful moments of my life. He'd been the boy who ran to me with scraped knees, who'd listened wide-eyed to his grandmother's Ute stories, who'd promised his dying father he'd always take care of me. Now he was about to betray everything Thomas had taught him about honor and truth. "Mr. McKinnon," Crawford began, "please tell the court about the changes you've observed in your mother's behavior over the past year." Samuel cleared his throat nervously, his eyes avoiding mine completely. "She's become different," suspicious and angry where she used to be loving and generous. She accuses Rebecca and me of terrible things, claims we've been lying to her about our financial situation. And have you been lying to her? We may have simplified some things to avoid worrying her unnecessarily, but we never meant any harm. I watched the faces of the jury as Samuel spoke. These were men from our county, ranchers, merchants, working men who understood the value of honest dealing. I could see skepticism growing in their expressions as Samuel's story unfolded. Can you give the court specific examples of your mother's erratic behavior? Crawford continued. Well, she's cut off all financial support without any reasonable explanation. She's installed expensive security measures on her property, acting like she's afraid of her own family, and she's been influenced by certain elements in the community who don't have her best interests at heart. The way he said certain elements while glancing toward where Running Bear sat made his meaning clear. He was trying to use prejudice against the Ute people to discredit my judgment. When Morrison rose to cross-examine Samuel and the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense, Mr. McKinnon, Morrison began. You testified that your mother has cut off financial support without reasonable explanation. How much money has she given you and your wife over the past 2 years? Samuel fidgeted in his chair. I don't know the exact amount. Would $3,240 sound about right? She's always been generous with us. That's not what I asked. Is that amount accurate? Possibly. And during the same period, how many times did you visit your mother for reasons other than asking for money? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Samuel's face reddened as he struggled for an answer. We always enjoyed visiting with her. That's not what I asked either. Can you name a single visit in the past 2 years where you didn't ask for or receive money? Another long silence. The jury was paying close attention now, and I could see understanding dawning in their faces. Morrison continued his methodical destruction of Samuel's credibility. Mr. McKinnon, you testified that you may have simplified your financial situation to avoid worrying your mother. Can you explain to the court what you mean by simplified? Well, we didn't want to burden her with all the details of our expenses, such as your monthly trips to Denver, staying in expensive hotels and dining in fine restaurants. Samuel's face went pale. How did you, we occasionally traveled to Denver on business. Business. What kind of business requires a ranch hand and his wife to stay at the Windsor Hotel and shop at the finest stores in the city? Crawford objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard enough to understand that Samuel and Rebecca had been living luxuriously on my money while claiming poverty. Rebecca's testimony was even more damaging to their case. Unlike Samuel, who at least showed some shame about his lies, Rebecca took the stand with defiant arrogance. Mrs. McKinnon, Crawford asked, please tell the court about your relationship with your mother-in-law. Eleanor has always been difficult, Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. She uses money to try to control people. And when Samuel and I started making our own decisions, she became vindictive. Can you give examples of this controlling behavior? She expected to be involved in every aspect of our lives. When we planned our wedding as a small, intimate ceremony, she took it as a personal insult. She's never accepted that Samuel is a grown man with his own family now. Morrison's cross-examination of Rebecca was devastating. Unlike Samuel, who at least tried to maintain some pretense of concern for my welfare, Rebecca couldn't hide her true nature. Mrs. McKinnon, Morrison began. You testified that the wedding was planned as a small, intimate ceremony. Who was invited to this ceremony? Just immediate family and close friends. And you didn't consider your husband's mother to be immediate family. Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. The ceremony was very small. We couldn't invite everyone we might have wanted to, but you did invite your own parents, didn't you, and your siblings? Yes, but... So when you said immediate family, you meant your immediate family, not your husband's. We had to make difficult choices. Morrison pulled out a sheet of paper. I have here a statement from the hotel in Denver where you stayed the night before your wedding. The bill shows charges for champagne, flowers, and a celebration dinner for 12 people. Does that sound like a ceremony that was too small to include one more person? Rebecca's face flushed red. We wanted to celebrate with the people who had supported our relationship from the beginning. And Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon, who had given you over $3,000 to support your household, hadn't supported your relationship. She always made us feel like we owed her something in return for her help, such as basic respect and honesty. Crawford objected again. But Morrison had made his point. The jury could see clearly that Rebecca viewed my generosity as her due, not as a gift to be appreciated. The most powerful testimony came from my community witnesses. Sheriff Morrison testified about my competence and my standing in the community. Jake Peterson described my business dealings in detail, emphasizing my reliability and sound judgment. Pastor Williams spoke about my consistent involvement in church activities and my moral character. But it was Running Bear's testimony that truly turned the tide. When Morrison called him to the stand, the old Ute elder walked forward with quiet dignity, ignoring the whispers from some of the spectators. "Mr. Running Bear," Morrison began, "how long have you known Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon?" "I have known her for 20 winters," Running Bear replied in his careful English, "since she came to this valley as a young woman with her husband. In your observation, has she shown sound judgment in her dealings with both the white and Ute communities among my people? We judge wisdom not by the color of skin or the number of years, but by actions. Eleanor McKinnon has always shown wisdom in her actions. She gives help when it is needed, but she does not allow herself to be used by those who would take advantage of her kindness. Have you observed any changes in her mental capacity or judgment recently?" Running Bear looked directly at Samuel and Rebecca before answering. "I have seen her become wiser. She has learned to see the difference between those who love her and those who love only what she can give them. This is not the sign of a failing mind. This is the sign of a mind that has learned important truths." As Running Bear returned to his seat, the courtroom was completely silent. His words carried the weight of cultural wisdom that transcended the legal arguments, and I could see their impact on the faces of the jury. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt confident that truth and justice would prevail. When Morrison called my name to testify, the packed courtroom fell completely silent. I stood and walked to the witness chair with steady steps, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was my moment to speak the truth, to defend not just my mental competency, but my dignity as a woman who'd spent 65 years earning respect through honest dealing and hard work. "Mrs. McKinnon," Morrison began after I'd been sworn in, "please tell the court, in your own words, why you decided to stop providing financial support to your son and daughter-in-law." I looked directly at the jury, 12 men from my county who understood the value of honest work and fair dealing. "I stopped sending money because I finally realized I was being lied to," I said clearly. "For 2 years, I believed my son and his wife were struggling to make ends meet. Every month, sometimes twice a month, they'd write or visit with stories about failed crops, medical emergencies, or urgent repairs that needed money I didn't have to spare. Can you give the court specific examples?" In August of last year, Rebecca wrote that she needed surgery in Denver for a female complaint. She said the doctor required payment in advance, and they didn't have the $100 he was asking. I sent the money immediately because I believed she was in pain and needed help. I pulled out one of Rebecca's letters from the folder Morrison had prepared. But when I went to the county clerk's office to review my financial records, I learned something interesting. Rebecca had been seen in Denver that same week, not at any doctor's office, but shopping in the finest stores and dining in expensive restaurants. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I could see Samuel sink lower in his chair, but Rebecca sat rigid with anger. "What did you discover about other requests for money?" Morrison continued. "Every emergency they described, every crisis that supposedly required my help, was either exaggerated or completely false. The failed crop that needed replanting, I rode by their farm and saw healthy plants growing. The roof repair that was so urgent their roof was in better condition than mine. How did this make you feel? Foolish at first, then angry, but mostly, it made me realize that my son and his wife didn't see me as a person worthy of honesty and respect. They saw me as a source of money to be managed and manipulated." Morrison guided me through the complete story: the secret wedding that excluded me, the discovery of their luxury spending in Denver, the systematic lies they'd told to keep the money flowing. With each detail, I could see the jury's expressions growing more serious, more understanding of what had really been happening. "Mrs. McKinnon," Morrison said, "your son and daughter-in-law claim that your decision to cut off support was irrational, the result of mental decline. How do you respond to that?" "I'd say that learning from your mistakes is the opposite of mental decline. A person with failing judgment keeps making the same errors over and over. A person with sound judgment recognizes when they're being taken advantage of and takes steps to protect themselves." "Do you regret helping your son when you believed he needed it?" "No. A mother should help her children when they're truly in need, but a mother also has the right to expect honesty in return." When love becomes a business transaction, when generosity is met with deception, it's time to step back and reassess the relationship. When Crawford rose to cross-examine me, I could see he was facing an uphill battle. The jury had heard the truth laid out clearly, and my calm, rational responses had demonstrated exactly the kind of sound judgment that contradicted his client's claims. "Mrs. McKinnon," Crawford began, "isn't it true that you've become increasingly isolated from your family as you've gotten older?" "I've become increasingly selective about who I spend my time with," I replied. "I prefer the company of people who value me for who I am, not what I can provide." "But don't you think cutting off your son completely was an extreme reaction?" "I didn't cut off my son. I cut off the lies and manipulation. If Samuel wants a relationship with me based on mutual respect and honesty, he knows where to find me." Crawford tried several different approaches, suggesting I'd been influenced by unscrupulous neighbors, claiming my mixed heritage made me unreliable, insinuating that my age had affected my judgment. Each attempt fell flat against my calm, reasoned responses and the clear evidence of my competence. "Mrs. McKinnon," Crawford said in desperation, "don't you think your son and daughter-in-law deserve some consideration for their youth and inexperience?" "They're not children," I replied firmly. "Samuel is 35 years old, and Rebecca is 28. They're old enough to work honest jobs and pay their own bills. They're certainly old enough to tell the truth to someone who's been helping them." "But surely family obligations run both ways," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. "I fulfilled my obligation to raise my son, educate him, and prepare him for adult life. His obligation is to treat me with the respect due to the woman who gave him life and opportunities. Taking my money under false pretenses isn't fulfilling family obligations, it's betraying them." The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Crawford couldn't shake my testimony or make me appear confused or irrational. Every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate my mental clarity and explain my reasonable decisions. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt lighter than I had in months. I'd told my story completely and honestly, defended my actions with clear reasoning, and shown the court exactly who I was, not a confused old woman, but a frontier woman who'd learned to protect herself from those who would take advantage of her generosity. As I returned to my seat, I caught Samuel's eye for the first time during the entire proceeding. What I saw there wasn't anger or defiance, but shame. Deep, genuine shame for what he'd put me through and what he'd become in the process. It was too late for that shame to change anything between us. But it gave me hope that someday, maybe, the boy I'd raised might remember the values his father had taught him. Morrison stood to address the jury for his closing argument. "Gentlemen," he began, "you've heard testimony today about systematic deception, financial exploitation, and family betrayal, but you've also heard testimony about wisdom, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon is not a confused old woman in need of guardianship. She's a competent, intelligent person who made the difficult but necessary decision to protect herself from those who saw her love as weakness and her generosity as opportunity. The question before you isn't whether Mrs. McKinnon should have continued supporting her son and daughter-in-law. The question is whether she has the right to make that decision for herself. And I submit to you that she not only has that right, she had the wisdom to exercise it." As Morrison sat down and Crawford began his closing argument, I knew that whatever the jury decided, I'd already won something more important than any legal victory. I'd stood up for myself, told the truth, and proven that age and gender didn't make me powerless. I was still Eleanor McKinnon, and I would not be defeated by anyone, not even my own son. After Crawford finished his closing argument, a desperate attempt to portray me as a vindictive old woman influenced by unscrupulous neighbors, Judge Harrison gave his instructions to the jury and sent them out to deliberate. The 12 men filed out of the courtroom with serious expressions, carrying the weight of a decision that would determine not just my legal status, but my right to live with dignity and independence. The weight was excruciating. Martha sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly, while the packed courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Running Bear and the other Ute elders remained in their seats, their presence a calm anchor in the sea of nervous energy that filled the room. "How long do you think they'll take?" Martha whispered. "However long it takes for 12 honest men to see through 2 years' worth of lies," I replied, though my stomach was tight with anxiety. Samuel and Rebecca sat across the aisle with their lawyer, but the confident arrogance Rebecca had shown earlier was gone. She kept glancing around the courtroom at all the faces that clearly supported me. Finally, understanding that her strategy of portraying me as a friendless, confused old woman had failed completely. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the bailiff returned to announce that the jury had reached a verdict. My heart pounded as the 12 men filed back into the courtroom, their faces giving nothing away. Judge Harrison took his place at the bench. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict in the matter of Samuel McKinnon versus Eleanor McKinnon, the jury foreman?" A rancher named William Thompson, whom I'd known for 15 years, stood and cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." "What is your verdict?" Thompson looked directly at me before speaking, and I saw something in his eyes that gave me hope. "Your Honor, we find that Mrs. Eleanor McKinnon is fully competent to manage her own affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied." The courtroom erupted. Cheers and applause filled the air as my supporters celebrated the victory. I felt Martha's arms around me, heard Running Bear's voice calling out approval in Ute, saw Pastor Williams removing his hat in a gesture of respect, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He rapped his gavel for silence, and when the room quieted, his expression was stern. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "based on the evidence presented in this case, I am deeply troubled by what appears to be systematic financial fraud perpetrated against Mrs. McKinnon. The testimony has revealed a pattern of deliberate deception designed to extract money under false pretenses." Samuel's face went white, and Rebecca gripped her chair so tightly her knuckles showed pale against her skin. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am ordering a full investigation into the financial dealings between the petitioners and Mrs. McKinnon. Sheriff Morrison, you will work with the county prosecutor to determine if criminal charges are warranted." Sheriff Morrison nodded grimly. "Yes, Your Honor. We'll begin immediately." Additionally, Judge Harrison said, looking directly at Samuel and Rebecca, "I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting the petitioners from contacting Mrs. McKinnon or approaching her property without her explicit consent. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest." Crawford started to object, but Judge Harrison cut him off. "Mr. Crawford, your clients have shown a disturbing willingness to exploit family relationships for financial gain. This court will not tolerate such behavior, and I want to make it clear that Mrs. McKinnon is under the protection of this court." Foresee how. As the judge's gavel fell for the final time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Not only had I won the legal battle, but the court had recognized what Samuel and Rebecca had done to me and was taking steps to ensure it couldn't happen again. The crowd pressed around me as we left the courthouse, offering congratulations and expressions of support. Jake Peterson shook my hand vigorously. "Mrs. McKinnon, that was the finest display of dignity under pressure I've ever seen." Pastor Williams approached with tears in his eyes. "Eleanor, you've shown us all what it means to stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost." But it was Running Bear's words that meant the most to me. "Granddaughter," he said in Ute, "today you have honored both your peoples. You have shown that wisdom and strength know no boundaries of age or blood." Outside the courthouse, I found myself face to face with Samuel one last time. He approached hesitantly, his hat in his hands, looking more like the boy I'd raised than the man who'd betrayed me. "Ma," he said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I need you to know that I'm ashamed of what I've done. What we've done." "Shame is a start, Samuel. But it's not enough to undo 2 years of lies and manipulation. I know I've lost the right to call you my mother. But I want you to know that Rebecca and I are leaving Colorado. We can't stay here after this. That's probably wise, and I swear to you, on Pa's grave, that I'll find a way to pay back every penny we took from you. It might take years, but I'll do it." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd grown so familiar with, but all I saw was genuine remorse and shame. "Samuel," I said finally, "if you truly want to make amends, don't just pay back the money. Become the man your father would have been proud of. Learn to work honestly, to treat people with respect, and to understand that love can't be bought or sold." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will. Ma, I promise I will." As Samuel walked away, I felt something I hadn't expected, not forgiveness. Exactly, but a kind of closure. The boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere, buried under years of poor choices and Rebecca's influence. Maybe someday he'd find his way back to the values Thomas and I had tried to teach him. But that was his journey to make. Mine was just beginning. That evening, Martha organized an impromptu celebration at my ranch. It seemed like half the county showed up, bringing food and drink and stories of their own struggles with difficult family members. Running Bear and several other Ute families joined us, and for the first time in years, I felt truly surrounded by people who valued me for who I was. "Eleanor," Martha said as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "What are you going to do now? You've got your freedom back, your reputation restored, and your money protected. The world is wide open for you." I thought about her question as I watched the stars come out over the Colorado mountains. For the first time in years, I had complete control over my own life. I could travel. I could invest in causes I believed in. I could build the relationships that mattered to me. "I think," I said finally, "I'm going to start living for myself instead of for people who don't appreciate what I have to offer. And I'm going to make sure that other folks in my situation know they don't have to put up with being used and manipulated by their own families." The victory was complete, but more than that. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, a chapter where I would write my own story instead of letting others write it for me. 6 months after the trial, I found myself sitting on my porch on a warm spring morning, watching Martha approach with yet another visitor, a woman I didn't recognize, riding side saddle and looking hesitant about approaching my ranch. Over the past months, word had spread throughout Colorado Territory about my court victory, and I'd become something I never expected to be a symbol of hope for other folks facing similar struggles with manipulative family members. "Eleanor," Martha called as she dismounted. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Catherine Brennan from up near Boulder. She's got a situation that sounds mighty familiar." Mrs. Brennan was a woman of perhaps 50, with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard all her life. As she told her story over coffee in my kitchen, I heard echoes of my own experience. Adult children who'd moved back home claiming temporary hardship, who'd gradually taken control of her finances while treating her with less and less respect. "Mrs. McKinnon," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "my daughter tells everyone in town that I'm getting forgetful, that I need her to manage my affairs. But I'm not forgetful. I just finally realized she's been taking my money to support her husband's drinking and gambling." "What do you want to do about it?" I asked directly. "I want them out of my house and out of my business, but I don't know how to make that happen without losing my daughter forever." I leaned back in my chair, remembering the same fears I'd had about Samuel. "Mrs. Brennan, let me ask you something. When did your daughter last speak to you with love instead of need? When did she last visit without asking for money or trying to control some aspect of your life?" The woman thought for a long moment, then shook her head sadly. "I can't remember." "Then you haven't had a real relationship with your daughter for some time already. What you have is a business arrangement disguised as family affection. The question is whether you want to keep paying for the privilege of being used, or whether you want to reclaim your dignity and independence." Over the next 3 hours, I shared everything I'd learned about recognizing manipulation, protecting assets, and building the strength to stand up to family members who saw love as weakness. By the time Mrs. Brennan left, she had a plan, a list of resources, and most importantly, the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her struggle. "You've got a gift for this," Martha observed after Mrs. Brennan had ridden away. "You've helped more folks in the past 6 months than most people help in a lifetime." It was true. Word of my willingness to counsel others had spread throughout the territory, and I'd found myself hosting a steady stream of visitors, mostly women, but some men too, who were dealing with exploitative family members. Each story was different in its details, but the underlying pattern was always the same: generous people being taken advantage of by those who should have loved and respected them most. But my work wasn't limited to individual counseling. I'd also become involved in broader community efforts to protect vulnerable citizens from exploitation. Working with Sheriff Morrison and several other county officials, we'd helped draft new laws making it harder for family members to gain inappropriate control over their relatives' finances. Mrs. McKinnon. Sheriff Morrison had told me during one of our planning meetings, "Your case opened a lot of eyes around here. We're seeing more people come forward to report family financial abuse, and we're taking it more seriously thanks to what you went through." The most rewarding aspect of my new role was the bridge building work I'd continued with Running Bear and the Ute community. Our successful collaboration during the trial had shown both communities that cooperation was possible and beneficial. I'd helped establish regular trade relationships between Ute artisans and white merchants, and I'd worked with Pastor Williams to create educational programs where children from both communities could learn about each other's cultures. Granddaughter, Running Bear said during one of our regular meetings, you have become what your mother always hoped you would be, a bridge between worlds, helping people understand that different ways can exist in harmony. The financial recovery from Samuel and Rebecca's fraud had been slower than I'd hoped, but more successful than I'd expected. The criminal investigation had resulted in charges being filed, though Samuel and Rebecca had fled to California before they could be arrested. However, Kansas. The court had ordered restitution, and I'd begun receiving small payments, evidence that Samuel was at least trying to keep his promise to pay back what he'd stolen. More importantly, I'd learned to manage my money more wisely. Instead of giving it away out of guilt or loneliness, I now invested it in causes and people who would use it to build something lasting. I'd helped fund the expansion of the schoolhouse to accommodate both white and Ute children. I'd provided low-interest loans to young families who demonstrated both need and responsibility. And I'd established a small fund to help other elderly citizens who found themselves victims of family exploitation. You know what I've learned, I told Martha as we sat watching the sunset from my porch one evening. Money is like water. It's most useful when it flows to where it's needed most. But it becomes dangerous when it pools in places where it stagnates or gets contaminated. That's quite a philosophy. It's taken me 66 years to figure it out, but I finally understand that the value of money isn't in having it, it's in using it wisely. As my 67th birthday approached, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that terrible day when Rebecca had announced their secret wedding. The pain of Samuel's betrayal had never completely disappeared, but it had been transformed into something useful, wisdom that I could share with others facing similar challenges. I'd received 2 more letters from Samuel over the months, each one reporting on his progress toward honest work and his efforts to pay back the money he'd stolen. The letters were respectful, but distant, acknowledging the damage that had been done while expressing hope that someday we might rebuild some kind of relationship. I hadn't responded to the letters, but I hadn't thrown them away either. Forgiveness, I'd learned, was a process, not a moment. Maybe someday I'd be ready to take that step, but for now, I was content to focus on the family I'd chosen rather than the one that had chosen to betray me. On the morning of my birthday, I woke to find my yard full of visitors, friends, neighbors, and people I'd helped over the past months, all gathered to celebrate not just another year of my life, but the new life I'd built for myself. Running Bear presented me with a beautiful blanket woven by the women of his band, its patterns telling the story of a woman who'd found strength in adversity and used that strength to help others. Martha had organized a feast that brought together dishes from a dozen different families, representing the diverse community that had rallied to support me. But the gift that meant the most came from Mrs. Brennan, who'd ridden down from Boulder specifically for the celebration. She pulled me aside as the festivities continued around us. "Mrs. McKinnon," she said, "I wanted you to know that I followed your advice. I told my daughter and her husband they had to leave my house and support themselves. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it was also the most liberating. How did it work out? Better than I dared hope. Once my daughter realized I wasn't going to be her personal bank anymore, she had to face the reality of her husband's problems. She's left him and found honest work, and for the first time in years, when she visits me, it's because she wants to see me, not because she needs something from me." As I looked around at the celebration in my honor, at the faces of people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, I understood that I'd found something more precious than the money Samuel and Rebecca had stolen from me. I'd found my true worth, and I'd learned to share it with people who deserved it. The Colorado stars shone bright that night, and as I sat on my porch after the last guest had gone home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died, complete contentment with my life and genuine excitement about the future. At 67, I was finally the woman I was meant to be, and I had many good years ahead to make the most of that knowledge. Task 16. The Colorado mountains taught me something that took 66 years to learn, that a person's worth isn't measured by how much they can give away, but by how much they respect themselves. Out here on the frontier, we know that the strongest foundations are built on solid ground, not shifting sand. When family treats you like a bank account instead of a person, when love comes with a price tag attached, it's time to remember that you're worth more than the sum of your generosity. The Ute people have a saying: "The river that gives all its water to others runs dry, but the river that keeps some for itself flows forever." I learned to be that river, generous but not foolish, loving but not desperate, strong enough to say no when yes would destroy me, if you've ever felt taken for granted by the people you love most, if you've ever wondered whether you're valued for who you are or what you can provide, then you understand Eleanor's journey. Sometimes the hardest lesson we learn is that we teach people how to treat us. When we accept disrespect disguised as need, when we confuse enabling with loving, we lose ourselves in the process. But it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, to build the family you deserve instead of settling for the one that takes advantage of your heart. Eleanor's story reminds us that strength isn't about how much we can endure. It's about knowing when we've endured enough. In the Colorado Territory of 1885, just like today, respect had to be earned and boundaries had to be maintained. Her journey from doormat to dignity shows us that it's never too late to stand up for ourselves and find our true worth.